Hi, everybody. Today I'm Mary Jane Maffidi, and today it's my great pleasure to interview Ron Corbett, with whom I have a very tangled relationship, but that'll come out later in the interview. Ron is an Ottawa-based writer, journalist, and broadcaster. He's the author of 7 nonfiction books, and his first novel, Ragged Lake, which is a fantastic book, was nominated for an Edgar Award by the Mystery Writers of America. Should have won, I thought. And he was also nominated for the Crime Writers of Canada Best Novel for that same book. His most recent book, The Sweet Goodbye, is the debut novel in a mystery series featuring undercover police officer Danny Barrett. The series is published by Berkeley, New York, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. And I believe, Ron, that you now have Tom Clancy's editor. I should also mention that The Last Guide, which is one of your nonfiction books, has been made into a film. So you've got a lot going on. And when I should also mention that you were the publisher of Ottawa Press and Publishing. So I'm not sure when you sleep, but we'll get to that. That's one of the questions later on. So when I first met you back in the mid-90s, you were, I think, the crime reporter, but it could have been court reporter for the Ottawa Citizen. And you came and spoke to capital crime writers, and we never forgot that. So it was a fantastic exposure to us to a whole world of investigating. Now, I have found that journalists and crime reporters bring something special to crime fiction. And so I would like to ask you, how those helped you in your journey to create these fantastic crime novels that you do?
Mary Jane, tangled relationship. You make it sound spicier than
now they want to know.
Perhaps we were, and it actually goes back further than that. I don't know if you even know this, Mary Jane. Maybe you just
perhaps I don't.
I'll spring this on you, but Prime Crime. You were involved with the bookshop, Prime Crime.
I was. That's right.
I lived on Clary Avenue.
Oh, did you?
Yes, at Prime Crime. Was it pretty much at the corner of
right around the corner? Oh,
yeah,
my
so I
heavens.
remember you from the bookshop in the should we say what decade? That was a decade before.
It was in our lifetime. Let's just
leave it in our lifetime. So anyway, it's a pleasure to speak with you today, Mary Jane. I was a city columnist, was the actual title.
Oh, city columnist. Well, I gave you these extra jobs. Sorry.
Yeah, but being a city columnist involved, going to courts and covering crime for some stories. When I had that job, it was maybe it's always a crazy period for the city, but it seemed like a very crazy period. It was mid-90s. You may remember some of the crime stories in the mid-90s. Sylvain Leduc, Charles Battersby, a drive-by shooting, our very first drive-by shooting. I remember that case, just a bizarre case. Sylvain Leduc, the Vanier teenager that was beaten to death as the kids were doing their homework in the piano. I'll never forget that case either. Right. Does that bring some authenticity to fiction writing? Yes, I believe it does. Yes, certainly.
Wow. Yes, I can just imagine. I think that journalism itself also brings something to it, and something that I see in your work is the ability to hook the reader right off. You don't have a lot of rambling. You've got us because you've got a paragraph to get our attention in the paper, and you translate that to your book writing. It really works. Congrats.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
So I have just finished reading The Sweet Goodbye, which is compelling and it's a thought-provoking book. And it's mostly told through the eyes, not completely, but mostly told through the eyes of the undercover cop, Danny Barrett, who is a great new character. Can you tell us about Danny Barrett? What makes him tick?
Okay. Well, Danny Barrett's an interesting character. And as you mentioned, Mary Jane, I have 2 series going at the moment, the Frank Yakabuski series and the Danny Barrett. People may be more familiar with the Frank Yakabuski series. There's been 3 books in that series. Danny Barrett, The Sweet Goodbye is a debut in that series. I'm just being lazy here and trying to give you a sloppy answer, because if you're familiar with the Frank Yakabuski series, Danny Barrett is a younger. Yeah, you're on the back of that, by the way. Our tangled relationship. You were gracious enough to give me a blurb on the back of Ragged Lake. Danny Barrett's a younger, more tormented, darker Frank Yakabuski, if you will. This series is also set in the States, although he moves around. This is kind of what I wanted to do. The Frank Yakabuski series is very much rooted in place. It's a Northern Divide, which is a real place. I've fictionalized it, I've reimagined it or imagined it. And it's always going to be on the Northern Divide. And that series is going to have Frank Yakabuski, and every story is going to have this air, I hope, of being a story set on the Northern Divide. Danny Barrett is an undercover cop who moves from place to place to place to place. So almost the antithesis of a series that's rooted in place. So a big difference there. The two characters certainly have similarities, but I'm looking forward to moving it around. Now, I haven't taken advantage of it yet, Mary Jane, because the first one, the Danny Barrett one, was set in northern Maine. So I'm like 20 miles from the Canadian border. The second one is set in Blaine, Washington. So I think I'm 10 miles from the Canadian border. The third one, we're going to go someplace a little bit warmer. But that's
In the
Danny
winter,
Barrett.
I hope. Yeah. Right.
But we're going to go somewhere warm on the third one, I think. Yeah.
Okay, that's so he is tormented character. He's also very likable, though. I found I warmed to him, even though you can see there's a dark cloud over both of their heads.
He's a darker character. He's a bit darker, you know. The nuts and bolts, the specifics of it, just and the plot is there. The reason he became an undercover cop was he was more or less he's from Detroit. That's where he was, a police officer in Detroit. He ended up involved in a case. Though I may even be saying stuff here that hasn't been published yet, because I'm familiar with his story more than what's been published. But there's a log story which hasn't been told yet. He can no longer stay in Detroit. His very first undercover case, he was more or less set up. He was as set up as anybody else was. Because of that, he has to leave Detroit, leave his hometown. So again, the exact opposite of what we have with the Frank Yakabuski character. And so that's what makes him conflicted, tormented. I don't like either of those words. He certainly is going to be a darker character. There's more going on with Danny Barrett's backstory than there is with Frank Yakabuski's backstory, which is very easy to understand, and there are no shadows in that story.
Right. Well, they were just there's a lot of subtlety in The Sweet Goodbye, and I found it. It's also kind of it's morose, but it also kind of reminds me of, I don't know, a piece of jazz or old blues or something like that, because there's so much going on in there. And I like both of the characters. And so it's been, I really liked Frank Yakabuski, but I do think that I think there's more going on with Danny, and I want to know things. And there were very interesting, subtle hints in The Sweet Goodbye about the Detroit part of the story, but you just giving us a little peek, so we buy the second book too, right?
Yeah.
And but here's a question that came up, and I was looking at Ragged Lake, and I had just finished The Sweet Goodbye. So Danny is undercover as, who would ever think of this? He's a tree marker. Okay, so I had, and then. Okay, what? There's a tree marker in Ragged Lake too. So I never heard of a tree marker. So I'd like you to talk about that. Where did this come from? How do you know about tree markers? And why are they so interesting? Because they do seem to be.
Well, Algonquin Park plays a part in the story, I guess, in the overall story. The Ragged Lake, the first novel in the Frank Yakabuski, it's dedicated to this guy named Frank Kwiak, who's the last guide. You mentioned the last guide, right?
I did, and I'll mention it again.
Okay. Well, Frank Kwiak was a fishing guide in Algonquin Park. I met him 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now, 2000, I met him. And it's a neat story. I'll tell it quickly. I was working for the Citizen.
Oh, don't be quick. We've got 45 minutes.
Okay. You're going to have to remind. This is one of these answers going to be so long-winded. You're going to have to remind me near the end what your question
no
was.
subordinate clauses.
But Algonquin Park is just such this is how the whole story starts. I meet Frank Kwiak when I'm up at Algonquin Park doing a completely separate story. I'm up there doing a story on wolves of Algonquin Park. There's a debate as to whether they're timber wolves or red wolves. I really am making a short story long. So I'm up there doing this feature on wolves for Algonquin Park. The wolves don't cooperate. They don't show up. They don't show up. There's a weekly wolf
like that.
Algonquin Park. I'm up there. They don't show up. It's a complete bust. The story's a bust. I phoned the Citizen. What should we do? They said, well, stick up. You'll go to the wolf howl the following week. Okay, all right, fine. I'll stay in Algonquin Park for a week. No complaints. But I've got a week to kill. What do I do for a week? As we're waiting for the wolves to show up. So I go into Whitney. little town right by the east gate of Algonquin Park.
Remember that is, right?
And I
Yeah.
start interview people there, interview naturalists. I interview anybody that's ever worked at Algonquin Park, it seems. And finally I said, well, we should interview some locals. That's always a good idea, interview some real people. So we go to the lunch bar. It's the Algonquin lunch bar in Whitney. And, does anybody know, I'm doing a story on wolves. Who should I talk to? I'll never forget. They said, well, you should talk to Frankie Kwiak. He's probably got one in his backyard. So Frankie Kwiak said, well, he's up the road there. So I go up the road and I find this guy, Frank Kwiak. And it turns out I spent 2 hours in there. It's just such a character. You walk in his house and there's stuffed animals everywhere. It's just the most bizarre thing. All of a sudden I was in Twin Peaks.
You mean taxidermied animals?
Taxidermy, yeah. Yeah, you walk in his house and you see all this bear eating. He's like, it's just bizarre. And he's got aquariums too. Oh, you should have seen it, the color in the house, because there's so many fish tanks. The fish tanks are all there for minerals because he's a fishing guy. I'm about to get to that. I'm interviewing him, and it turns out he tells me, well, what do you do for a living? I'm a fishing guy. And I said, well, nobody does that anymore. He says, I know, I'm the last one. And I started talking to him, and son of a gun, he used to be a guide at the Highland Inn, and he is a full-time fishing guide. So at which point I phoned the Citizen. I said, listen, forget the wolves. We got a better story here with this guy. So I did the story of the last guide. And one of the reasons I did that, as a kid, that was our summer vacation. We went up to Algonquin Park. So we were always up on Algonquin Park, and you'd see people like Frank Kwiak. And I was always impressed with them. They were like cowboys. If I was in Montana, growing up in central Canada with rivers and lakes in Algonquin Park going fishing, a fishing guide was the equivalent of a cowboy. Like seeing these people at Lake of Two Rivers campground and Killarney Lodge and everything. It was like seeing real live cowboys. Tree markers are the same thing. Tree markers are out there with the fishing guys. Tree markers are the people that work for forestry companies. You send them out and they'll mark your land. This tree is worth taking down. This tree is worth taking down. So they know everything about trees, like fishing guys know everything about fish. So they're impressive people. In my mind, they're very impressive characters. And yeah, I've had 3 stories actually that have had tree markers in it. And I think 4 that have had fishing guides. So that's why he's there. Mary Jane, you may have frozen on me. Okay. Something has happened here. Mary Jane, are you there? I am not hearing you, Mary Jane.
Mary Jane, you're muted.
Is that what's happening here?
Yeah, I think I
there
think
we
the
go.
wind is high in our neighborhood, and it's maybe affecting.
The wind
things.
is ferocious right now.
Yeah,
Yeah, people know
so
you're like less than a mile. You're half a mile from where.
yeah, so that's our story. We're sticking to it. Thank you, Mike, for rescuing. So you were in Algonquin Park with Frank and telling me about the tree markers. Yeah.
Yeah, Ragged Lake is dedicated to Frank Kwiak, so there's a connection all the way through on that.
Oh, that's it. That's fantastic. Well, I've only seen you on the streets of Ottawa and in our own little village of Manotick, and you're always looking urbane, city guy, but you seem to have an affinity for wilderness. So in the books, it's transporting for the reader. I mean, I was transported to the places in both of these books. And that's not the only Frank Yakabuski I've read, but I mean, we're just taken there. So I'm interested in how you came to know this scenery, and they're different places, but they're both fairly wild. How'd you come by that knowledge? Was it the summers in Algonquin Park or beyond that?
Well, yeah, some of it comes from living in Ottawa too. Ragged Lake, and people comment on there's a lot of Ottawa. There's a lot of the Ottawa Valley in these novels. Some of it obvious, some of it hidden. It's as simple as place names and what have you.
William Street.
Yeah, exactly. Yakabuski,
the cheese shop.
Yakabuski itself is an Ottawa Valley name. The MLA for that area, for Renfrew Nipissing, I think is the riding, is John Yakabuski. Yakabuski Hardware Store was in Barry's Bay for decades. So that's an Ottawa Valley name. And that was intentional, Mary Jane. I wanted to write, when I started the series, when I was writing Ragged Lake, the country noir was the phrase I was using. I stole it. Winter's Bone, I just seen that movie, the Jennifer Lawrence movie, Winter's Bone. If you've never read the book, I had just read the book. Anyways, that's place, country. I wanted
Right.
to have a noir series. Quite often noir, you think of the city, right? Raymond Chandler and
Right, you
James
do.
Dean and
Yeah.
what have you. I wanted to have that same sort of a feel. But yeah, totally in the bush.
Well, that sort of explains how I was feeling, particularly the sweet goodbye. That I felt that in that dying community in Maine, I felt it was a dying community in
Yeah,
Maine, and
yeah.
with this wild, unexplored, and really lawless wilderness that's surrounded it. And I was thinking, it's not very far from here, but it might as well be on another planet. It's so different. So it's hard to imagine the 21st century, but what kind of research allowed you to create that? I know you talked about the influence of the Ottawa Valley on it, but
Yeah.
did you go down to Maine? Did you? I hope you didn't go in those woods because you'd be lucky to be alive.
Well, you know, where the North Main woods, again, this week goodbye, like the Yakabuski series, like Ragged Lake, it starts with something that's real. It always starts with something real. Cormac McCarthy had this great line. I'm reading his newest novel right now, so maybe I'm thinking of it, but he was commenting about magical realism one time, and Marquez and everybody, and he was going on and on, be very polite and diplomatic, and he said, you know, I enjoy it, I like it, and then he said, almost sort of exasperated, but at some point you got to make it real. You know, okay, you go out, have your fun, but at some point you've got to make it real. So the North Main Woods, which is where a lot of the Sweet Goodbye takes place, is a real place. And maybe it comes from a journalism background, but you don't have to make stuff up to get stuff that's crazy. The North Main Woods, which is a real place, is basically timber rights. Nobody lives in the North Main Woods. It is a population area. It is a census area. So when the U.S. does its census, the population for the North Main Woods, do you want to take a guess what it is? The population?
16.
It's zero. It's zero. Why? It's zero. Why do we even bother with the pot? It is zero. It is nothing but timber rights. So it's nothing but logging roads. It's nothing but bush camps. It's a completely transient area that's the size of Rhode Island, and it's the northern half of Maine, which runs right up to the Quebec border. You go down from the eastern townships, and you're into the North Main Woods.
And that's the St.
So it
John
is a real
That's the
place.
St.
It sounds exotic because it's crazy. Now, when I was writing The Sweet Goodbye, it was the pandemic.
Oh,
So I got about as close to the North Main Woods. I swear to goodness, I was the other side of a bridge, you know, a customs barricade on a little bridge over a river. And that was as close as we could get to the North Main Woods.
you couldn't cross the border. Wow.
Across the
Right.
border. It was the middle of the lockdown during the pandemic. So
You see, nobody would ever guess that. I'll tell
it,
you. They would never
yeah,
guess
but
that.
no, it's not dissimilar from the bush around, which I am familiar with. You know, I had children that went to Bishop, so I'm familiar with Eastern Townships. I'm familiar with the area around the Main Woods.
Right.
So,
Okay.
but it is that
Well,
exotic. Again, I guess the answer, you don't have to try too hard to make it exotic.
but
The Northern
it
Divide
just
is a real place. Is a real place. You go up there and you'll think you're on another planet. It's a real place. The Goyen Reservoir, which are the headwaters for it's a real place.
well, you certainly made it you scarified it
Yeah.
plenty because it was very
The Goyen
alarming place
Reservoir is
for the
scary.
reader to find
You don't wanna
herself
spend-
in. Right. So Danny and Frank, they transport the readers to some very dark places in the heart and soul. And I guess that's maybe another part of setting, because and maybe that's when you talk about country noir. That's what it is. But these are complicated people, and they're complicated issues, and they're not all that straightforward. So I'd like to talk about your characters. They're complex. The men and women in The Sweet Goodbye all seem to be quite a dramatic mixture of good and bad. And some of your shadier characters in The Sweet Goodbye were surprisingly likable, and I didn't expect that. I mean, I like the good guys. I don't like the bad guys, right? But I warmed to them, and I began to care about them, and I wanted things to turn out all right for them. So I'd like to know, did you plan it that way, or did they grow on you as you explored the
Yeah.
book and began to write it?
Um, It's an interesting question, Mary Jane, for a few reasons. Talking about our tangled relationship. Let's get back to that. The readers have dozed off for a minute here. Let's get back to our
Yeah.
tangled relationship.
I'll ring a bell or something
Tom
soon.
Colgan. We both know Tom Colgan.
Oh, yes, we
I should
do.
let listeners.
Tom Clancy's editor.
You've had the same editor, so
I
you're
did.
being all diplomatic here, but you also have had books published with Berkeley, and
Yeah.
you have had Tom Colgan as your editor, who's the same editor I have right now.
Yeah, it's a great
Um,
guy.
he's a great guy. But your question is interesting because there is a second book the second book in that series, in the Danny Barrett series, is already written. It's submitted. It's in the hands of Tom Colgan. And I've got a character in there. I have to tell you, I do like bad guys. I like bad guys, and I think if
It
you like
showed.
the
It shows.
in Ragged Lake, you said the same thing. Ragged Lake, I have Tommy Bangles. I think is a great character. Roy McGregor loved Tommy Bangles. I
Yes.
like the villain. I like the bad. So if you like the character, it's easy to, I guess, get a sense. The reader can get a sense of, don't hate this character. The next Danny Barrett one has a bad guy who is about as bad as he's. I just get tingly thinking about how bad he is. But Tom Colgan says, I like the guy at the end. And I said, that's exactly right. And it was always kind of a challenge. I'm going to make this guy, like, just what he actually does is so despicable. You should never like this guy. And yet, if I've done my job properly in some of the final scenes, you will find yourself secretly rooting for this guy. And maybe you'll even like take a step back, say, well, what am I doing? What am I doing? Have I forgotten what this guy did? Hopefully you have. But I think that's just something I enjoy doing, Mary Jane.
Well, that is great. And I was thinking about not just the villains, and
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the two villains in the Ragged Lake and the villain in the Sweet Goodbye, like the most villainous type, but even the next layer of characters,
Yeah.
they were very morally ambiguous, shall we say, but still very likable. And I don't mind if the villains get it in the end, of whether I like them or not, but I cared about those. So as I was talking about, I had a question about world-class villains. So Tommy Bangles and Beau LaFontaine. I mean, these are the stuff of disturbed sleep. And what can you tell us about ramping them up as you're writing them? Or do they just come to you fully formed and ready to murder?
They don't come fully formed, but I do like the villains. If we're staying on the topic of the villains, Tommy Bangles had a nephew, Bobby Bangs, in Mission Road, which is the third one in the Yakabuski. The Bangle family comes back. But I don't. It sounds cliche to say you don't write black and white, but even this character, as I said, this really atrocious bad guy that I have in the Danny Barrett novel coming up. I don't think it'd be fun for the reader. It wouldn't be fun for me if you just made somebody just so villainous. There's and getting back to journalism, maybe go all the way back to the start of the interview, Mary Jane, but talking about journalism, maybe that is just something that comes from journalism. There's been a debate for years around whether journalism was a good background for a fiction writer. Tom Wolfe and John Cheever went at it like cats and dogs back in the 80s on this whole debate. One was a journalist, one was not. Take a guess whose side they were on. I would go, if I had that debate today, I would be on the side of people that say a journalism background is a great thing to have for a fiction writer. Because going to court case, and I'm trying not to make this sound cliche, but there is both two sides to every story I've ever come across in a court case, with the possible exception of Sylvain Leduc and the people that were charged with his murder. But with that as the one exception, everybody has a story, and it's easy to find some redeeming quality when sentencing. They call it aggravating and mitigating factors. Virtually everybody has a mitigating factor. Virtually everybody. It's very rare that somebody doesn't have a mitigating factor. So if you're honest with your writing, that should be there. You should have some empathy for all your characters. And I do have empathy in a very big way. Maybe this again comes from the stories I did, but people can get themselves in bad situations. And it doesn't make everybody a bad person. People can get them in horrendously bad situations. It's like bankruptcy. I just heard on the radio today the old Hemingway line: how do people go bankrupt? Well, it happens in two ways: gradually and then suddenly. You know, it's too late to make one. And you know, when bad things happening, when things fall apart, they really start to fall apart. And I have some empathy for people that are living through that. Most of us have lived through that at some point.
Right. You can see that sort of thing. There were a couple of really interesting books about written about some of the gangs that we had in Ottawa. And I'm thinking of the Stopwatch Gang and the Champagne Gang.
Yeah,
And they were
both of the Champagne Gang.
they were
You
obviously
remember them?
villains, but
Yeah.
they were great, right?
Well, the Champagne Gang were a bunch of they were also called, that's for the Beverly Hills 9021 gang. Is that what we referred to as the Champagne Gang? They were just characters. I think it was the
Yes, they
same
were all
gang.
hysterical. And
They were just characters. They
so
were
you
these
didn't
rich
want to
kids
be at
who were
the
breaking
facing
into
down a
jewelry
gun
stores.
with them, but you know, if they were robbing your bank branch, but they had interesting lives. And
Yeah,
even after
they
they were
did.
in
And
jail, they had
the
interesting lives.
stopwatch gang was Patty Mitchell.
Yeah,
Sorry, it was
Patty
Patty
Mitchell.
Mitchell.
Yeah.
And his brother, Pinky Mitchell, was a city employee for 50 years or so. Pinky Mitchell used to be the Navy boxing champion. And anyways, yeah, it's, you know, I interviewed Patty Mitchell when he finally went down for the last time in Mississippi. He was arrested in Mississippi. I did a jailhouse interview with with Patty Mitchell. And it was funny, I had trouble booking, a true story. I had trouble reaching him. He's in jail. He's just been arrested for armed robbery in South Haven, Mississippi. Tried to get him a jailhouse interview, getting nowhere. 4 days into it, I finally got a return phone call. I swear, his first line out of him, Mr. Corbett, I apologize for the delay. I've been somewhat tied up. He's in the jail in South Haven, Mississippi.
You couldn't make it up.
It's okay, Patty. So yeah, so how can you not like a guy like that? He was raised on Preston Street. Anybody's listening, I know people, not everybody's from Ottawa, but from Ottawa. They used to say families on Preston Street got tougher the lower the address got. The Mitchells were 5 Preston Street.
5
They had
Preston
a
Street.
single digit address on Preston Street. So that's
I
great
love
local
that.
history, Mary Jane. How can you not like that?
Yeah, that's you just gotta love it, and they're very interesting. And yes, so back to the Sweet Goodbye. I got a touch of whiplash with the plot twists in Sweet that I didn't see coming. I mean, I'm going along and I'm thinking this is going to happen. And that happens that I never even imagined, and then this happens that I never
Right.
imagined. So, sorry, Nick, you did some Voltaire, but you did play fair with us. So I'd be kind of interested in your plotting process, how that came to be. And the plot twists were particularly effective because of the relationship with the reader and the people involved. Over to you.
These are all unscripted questions. Have you told people that? You were asking me whether I want it. Is this your unscripted question that you're going to spring on me here?
No, there's
It's everything's unscripted. Well, it's, you know, the plot twist. I should give a shout out. There was an editor involved in This Week Goodbye, Sarah Brown, who maybe she's even signed up for this. She's a big mystery fan. She's an editor at, I think she's a managing editor now at Canadian Geographic. You may even know Sarah. I don't know if you
I
passed.
think I in passing when she was at
Yeah. And she was, you know, if you have some whiplash, Sarah might have, you know, might be partially responsible for some of the whiplash. I always knew what was going to happen to the characters without giving it away. I got people listening, if you don't want to ruin it, if somebody hasn't read it, and if you haven't read it, it's just for sale in bookstores right now. But I always knew what was going to happen to the characters. But Sarah, when the first time she went through it, said it was a little bit too obvious what was going to happen to the characters, and you should disguise it. You should, you know, present other options. So very good editing advice, people listening. So I did add a few things here and there. Didn't have to add much, so that it wasn't. So it could have been something else. And I think I know the scene where one of the scenes, the scene with Pearl LaFontaine and Lee and Travis Lee on the bluff, which is called Champlain's Lookout, by the way. You're talking.
Yes,
about
I remember. I noted that. Right.
in northern Maine, which he got pretty close. You know, close enough. Yeah. So I always knew what was going to happen there. I always knew what was going to happen to characters, but I rewrote it so that other possibilities, and maybe even one, would have been what you expected, which is not what happened. So that's how you get some of the prizes. The characters, Pearl LaFontaine was an interesting character. She became more and more important to the story as the story was written. So that is a character that evolved as it was written. So, you know, I don't really know if there's a process in getting that dimension to the characters. Uh, but in terms of the whiplash and the plot, I did know, and I'm becoming more of a fan of this, of having some idea where the hell you're going when you're starting. Okay. You should just jump off a cliff and assume you'll build wings before you hit the bottom. Uh, we are getting older, and I'm beginning to think a little bit of planning. There's maybe something for that. And so I have a rough idea where the plot is going.
Right.
So, but that can still change, but you should have a rough idea. Characters can develop wonderfully. And Pearl LaFontaine, I think, is a character that did that.
She's an exceptional character, I thought. Originally you think she's going to be a walk-on, right? And but it doesn't take very long before you see there's more to her, and the scenes that are told through her eyes are very powerful. And no, she is, I would say, she's a character that people will remember long after they've finished the book. And so that is great. So this makes me wonder, though. Now we're talking about plot, which evolves, and when you were changing it, you were really just misdirecting us a little bit, just saying, "Oh, look, a bird! There's a bird." When we're doing something wicked over here,
which I realize happens more often than I realize. Well, once you've done it as a writer, you see it in the books. You said, "Oh, okay," this is not a coincidence. This is clearly so. Yeah.
But that was lots of fun. So, but what kickstarts your writing when you're starting a new project? Say these new Danny Barrett projects. What does it start with? Does it start with the character? Does it start with a plot idea? Does it start with a setting? Because I can see in Danny Barrett, any one of those could dominate. But what's the kickstart?
That's a lovely question. It probably starts with a setting. It starts with a scene. Which well, that's just what it is. I'm about to complain about it, but it starts with a scene. The Sweet Goodbye, getting back to the scene we were just talking about, that was how that story started. The problem is that it never starts with an opening scene. I wish it would start with an opening scene, and then the second scene appears in the third scene.
Yeah.
So, but it started with that scene of what happened between Travis Lee and Pearl LaFontaine on the bluff on Champlain's Lookout. What transpired?
Oh, really?
Was the very first thing I had. That was how do you get to that scene? Everything, in a way, backed up to how you get to that scene. So how do you get those characters on that bluff at that particular moment, and what's about to happen?
And doing what they do. Right. Wow. Right. And it's all, and we believe it. Right.
Well, hopefully you believe it, but
I believed it. Hook, line, and sinker.
I love your question, Mary Jane. I wish people listening, I know there's writers listening. I'd be curious to know that is one question. As a writer, what would you want to ask another writer? That is a question I would love to ask them. Is how does it start? Do you start with the plot? I'm envious of people. If anybody out there, their answer is, well, I start with the plot. I start with A, B, C, soup to nuts. I start with the plot. Then, I'm envious, because that would be such a nice way to write. Because
it seems easier than it has been.
So you just roll it out. That's just absolutely lovely. But if you start with a scene 2/3 of the way through a story, which is easy to do, then it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You're starting with this one piece. It is a jigsaw puzzle.
Right.
I don't know. Is it always a jigsaw puzzle? Yeah, you're a writer. Is it a jigsaw puzzle for you? Putting scenes together?
I don't usually like to know how it ends. I like to know what kind of person would do this thing and roughly why, what their motivation would be. But I don't want to know who they are, because then I wouldn't be interested enough to write the book. But that makes for more work. I will tell you that. And when I see people who do outlines, if I did an outline, I would think, well, I know what happened. I'll do something else now, because I've just lost all
You've just right.
Been there, done that.
Yeah.
But so this reminds me, because we have a different intertangled relationship. You're also my new publisher. So and so now you're in this crime fiction world from as an author and as a publisher, and you've had different publishers in Canada. You got quite a body of work. So what kind of a juggling act is that? I'm wondering, do you work from 3 to 5 in the morning on your books? You've got a lot going on. So tell us about it.
Okay.
Only the part that's our business.
Well, I get to argue with myself, Mary Jane, which is great. Being both a writer and a publisher, I could come up with excuses as to why I haven't done it, why I haven't met the deadline. I could get annoyed. You really want me to believe that? I know what happened. So I gotta say, it's lovely running Ottawa Press and Publishing. It's lovely getting the people involved in it. you're involved with it. Mike Martin's involved with it. Don Butler has been a
Yeah.
panelist.
Our whole panel was involved in it, except for the moderator. You can get her another time.
I love
right.
being a regional publisher. I love being a regional publisher. It's making our last two authors have both lived on Glen Avenue. I'm making a joke now saying we're so regional, we just publish people who live on Glen Avenue and Long Island Road in Manatee. But I love being a regional publisher. It ties in so nicely with one of the reasons I'm doing it, I think Ottawa should have a regional publisher. We're broadcasting from Ottawa. Ottawa's a big enough city. Central Canada, it's a lovely area. I love the area. We should have a regional publisher. I shouldn't have to go to Toronto to get my stories published. That annoys me. So let's have a regional publisher. So I love that part of it. I love the people that are involved with the project. Joanna D'Angelo, she gave a shout out to some of the people, Terry Tile, Dave Tile, all the authors, Andrew King. I love publishing Andrew King stories. An artist, one of the most creative people I've ever met. So being a publisher is a lot of fun. Now this is all this has happened within the last you're talking the last few years. How does it all roll together? I get up early in the morning to write. That's a short answer to your question. I get up at 5 in the morning, most days at 5. I'm writing before 6. And I love the feeling of 9 o'clock in the morning, having something done. 9 o'clock in the morning, I come around, it's a lovely feeling of saying, okay, the rest of this day can be useless. It's already worthwhile because I've got 3 good hours under my belt. And then you move on. Although the tricky thing is, I don't know if you find this, I do think if you're writing, there does come a point where you got to immerse yourself into it. Stephen Harper once said, well, I could write a book because I dedicate. This is going to sound like an anti-Stephen Harper thing. It's just an aside. It happens to be Stephen Harper.
Keep going.
This isn't a political comment, but he says I partition 15 minutes a day, and I write for 15 minutes a day, and I do that every damn day. And after 7 years, I've got a hockey book. And I felt like, yeah, and it reads like you're writing for 15 minutes every damn day for 7 years. There comes a point when you got to immerse yourself into it. And I haven't quite figured out that part, but my wife would tell you I haven't quite figured that part out. There does come a point where, when you're finishing the story, you've got to immerse yourself into it. And then it's hard to have the two hats, but generally it works.
Right. Well, it certainly works for me, and I think it works for your other writers. And it's been great to, and I love the books that you have in your line. You have a lot of people that like Bruce Deachman and Laura Paquette, and great people in it. So you're making a difference there. So now moving to another area, you're with Random House now. And of course, you're writing for the reader, but I think people are interested in knowing, this question has come up in a panel, say the difference between writing a book for a Canadian publisher or writing a book for a US publisher. I know the book is for the reader and for the writer, but still you're going to go through a process with each one. And so there must be pros and cons or advantages and disadvantages. So what are you, and maybe Tom's not listening, so spill,
Well, there's certainly a difference between Canadian publishers and American publishers. Don't know if I want to get into that with
yeah, I know. Kachin.
But there's difference, there's different, there's different business models, there's different ways of doing business. So the publishing is certainly for the aspect different. From a writing point of view, there shouldn't really be any difference. Canadian writers have, with a Canadian locale, have been extremely, Louise Penny, a current example. I don't think you should, the book itself shouldn't change. I don't know whether, well, for fiction, we're talking fiction here. For nonfiction, it'd be a different story. But if you're writing a fiction book, I don't think you should tailor it to an American publisher or a Canadian publisher. The book should be the book you want to write as well as you can write it. I don't think that changes. How you market the book, how you try to sell the book, how you pitch the book, maybe that all becomes different between an American and Canadian publisher. How interesting is that, though? Do we want to talk about that?
Right. Sure.
No, the story
marketing is different.
The story should stay the same. I think the story should stay the same.
Okay, the story should stay. The story would stay the same. I think the book
would stay the same.
Stay the same. But I think that it's a really with marketing in the US, it's a really happening thing. It's just, and the authors get out there and they beat the bushes and they do a lot too. And I find myself
here's
in the dust.
Sorry, and this is not a knock against Canadian publishers. It is, a lot of times it's a matter of size. You got the U.S. market. US publishers make money. You know, Penguin Random House is one of the biggest corporations in the United States. You know, President Biden gets involved in an antitrust action against Penguin Random House for you know, for becoming too big because they want to buy. Who is it they're buying? Is it not Scribner's? It's Simon Schuster. So it's a big business. They make money. Canadian publishers, there's some that survive that don't make a lot of money, and you can do that in Canada. You can survive as a Canadian publisher without making a lot of money. There's government assistance, there's government help, there's ways of doing it. In the States, you need to make money. So there is a more commercial bend to it for certain. It also works. It also works. And, it's nice selling books. You know, I guess that's one thing I learned from being a publisher's hat. I don't feel bad about selling books. And American publishers don't feel bad about selling books. So there's a
like
cultural difference. There's a little bit. But again, for the author, it shouldn't make much of a difference. You know, your story should be exactly the same. How you present it to your publisher, how your agent presents it, maybe that's all different, but the story shouldn't change.
Right. So I don't think we have any questions. One might come in, but usually in the audience, there are people who are authors or would like to be authors, thinking about writing. So there'll be people out there, various stages. And do you have any advice? You've done a lot of stuff. You've got all the nonfiction. The Last Guide's been made into a film, which is fantastic. You've got nonfiction, fiction, Canadian publisher, US publisher, your own publishing business. What kind of advice would you like to offer people who are getting started or even sort of early in their careers? Or I'll take advice too, that's all.
Okay. Well, you know, we've already had the Hemingway bankruptcy line. You don't know.
Yeah.
That's a great Hemingway. That's a great Hemingway line. Is, you know, what's the toughest part about writing a novel? Or that one. That was a New York Times interview. And just get back to the journalism thing. We had an early interview. Excuse me, an early interview with Hemingway. So he was making the switch over from journalism to, you know, being a fiction writer. And so it would have been one of the first couple books. A New York Times interview, very nice New York Times interview with one of your first couple books. And the person said, you know, what have you found to be the hardest part? The transition from journalism to literature. What did you find to be the hard? You know, and Hemingway listened to this long, convoluted question. He says, the hardest part about writing a novel? Finishing the fucking thing. Sorry.
Okay, everybody out there, listen to that. But I think you're right.
It's finishing the damn thing. So don't underestimate it. So many people talk about writing, finding the voice and everything, and then you almost don't want to ask the question. You don't want to embarrass them because you will. Have you finished it? Well, no. You know, it all starts with finishing it. So advice number one is, you know, you have to finish it. You know, maybe we should just leave it at Hemingway's advice. You know, finish it. And learning how to finish it. There's so many ways not to finish it. You know, Ragged Lake, the first novel, I'm not giving myself the example or anything, but I was your classic journalist or editor. I had a half-finished novel in my desk drawer, you know, for 10 years. There's parts in Ragged Lake that have been kicking around in my desk drawer for close to 10 years before I finally. And it was a New Year's resolution. It was funny. It was a New Year's resolution, 2017. Okay, enough of this. At the end of this year, you're not going to sit here with this unfinished, you know, novel in your desk drawer. You're going to sit here with it being rejected by every publisher in Canada, and you're past this. And yeah, so finish it. I don't know. It sounds, maybe that's not enough of an answer, but my advice would be really, it all starts with finishing your story.
Right, that's great, because you can finish the book, and then if you're not happy with it, you can fix the book.
Yeah, and
or
people can comment on it. You know, asking your
right.
friends to keep on making suggestions on the first couple of chapters of your novel might be asking too much after a few years.
Yeah, I know, they just sort of don't take your calls after a while. Correct now.
No,
But what about Frank? Is he coming out of the closet again?
He's coming out of the closet. Yeah, there'll be something new on Frank next year. There may be something new on. Well, just yes, Frank is going to return next year. He might return a couple of times next year.
Oh, that's great. Oh, a couple of times. All right. Oh, you're a busy person, Ron. All right. But this is great. Well, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed the new book. It was really great, and I look forward to meeting Danny Barrett again.
You held up my book, by the way. Have you held up your own book here?
I haven't held up my own book. You mean this book?
That book.
Oh,
That
You
book.
light up my
That's
desk.
my publisher hat.
Freshly
He's a
out from
great book.
Ottawa Press and Publishing,
There you go.
which is also the publisher for my friend Mike
You're
Martin.
there- you're-
Now see
you're
it on
at
the
a-
lower screen.
And you're at a book signing at the Signatures Christmas show this coming
Yes.
Friday. There you
That's
go.
right. I hope we can see some people there. Yeah.
so
Thanks
we're
very
now into self-promotion time, and
Selfless.
and so I have a question. I have one question from the audience, and then we're going to close off.
Oh.
So Ron, how do you find the audience for your book? Is this decision made before you start writing?
How do I find? You mean, should you think about who the audience for a book would be? I knew when I started the Frank Yakubuski book, Ragged Lake, what kind of story I wanted to write. As I mentioned, Mary Jane, I wanted it to be a country noir. I had a little bit of an advantage in terms of trying to figure out what your audience may be, because I was a city columnist, a newspaper columnist for many, many years. I had a sense of what stories readers enjoyed. I knew they liked The Last Guide, you know, the nonfiction book, which was a story started as a feature in the Citizen. So it's an interesting question. I figured anyone that liked The Last Guide would like Ragged Lake, to be honest with you. And I figured that would be the audience, and the audience is out there. And if you like the story about the fishing guide, here's a story about somebody. It could be a fishing guide, but surprise, he's a cop. And here we go. And that's what I figured would be the audience for that series.
Thank you, Ron. So
Thank you.
Mary Jane, I'll leave you to thank Ron. I just want to remind people that you can get Ron's books and Mary Jane's books and my books at all the independent bookstores in Ottawa, at Perfect Books, at Books on Beechwood, and at the new Spaniel's Tale book in Westboro. So Mary Jane, over to you. We're back on at 5 o'clock with the last panel of the day. We'll see you then.
Great. Thanks, Mike. That's great. Yeah. There you are, Ron.
Here,
Thank you so much for making this be fun. I
Well, thank you,
really
Mary Jane.
enjoyed it. I sort of wish we had been in the same room with, you know, the lights flickering because there's a storm outside. But I actually I felt I got to know you a bit better through this book too, and then your questions really filled in a lot of things that I was wondering. So all I can say is they're fantastic books. Keep them coming. And thanks for publishing them.
well, Mary Jane, thank you very much. And thank you for doing the interview. It's a lovely interview. And you know, as a journalist, I've done a lot of interviews. That was a lovely interview. Thank you so much.
Well, it was sort of fun for me. So thank you. Bye.